The galaxy's impending doom was palpable. For centuries, Earth had been a quiet, forgotten planet on the fringe of galactic politics, its people scattered and fractured after the crushing defeat in the last Great War. Now, with the galactic sovereignty growing bolder in its conquest of the outer systems, Earth had been forgotten. Or so they thought. Commander Mara Shaw stood in the shadows of the control room, staring at the holographic map of the galaxy, her hands clenched around the railing, knuckles white, as alien forces consumed system after system, their warships outpacing any effort humanity could muster. Her heart pounded with a combination of fear and rage. Earth, once a powerful world, was now a shell of what it had been. Its technology was old, its fleet shattered. Yet, something had changed. The news had come as a whisper at first. Rumors of an ancient weapon, buried deep beneath Earth's surface, that could alter the course of the war, if it could be unlocked. The Crimson Catalyst, they called it. A weapon so powerful, it was said to have been the driving force behind humanity's rise to galactic prominence long ago, until it was buried to prevent its catastrophic misuse. Mara's mission was simple: find it before the alien empires did. But she knew better than to believe anything was simple when it came to intergalactic warfare. The Sovereign had its eyes on Earth, its spies scattered across the stars, and its agents embedded on every major world. Earth's only advantage was its secrecy, and Mara intended to use it. She turned to face her team, standing silent and grim in the room. Each one of them had been handpicked, not only for their combat prowess, but also for their loyalty. They knew what was at stake. Lieutenant Jackson Green, a sharp-eyed strategist with a reputation for quick decisions, spoke first. "We've located the site, Commander. It's buried under miles of dense rock in an old facility in the Siberian wastes. It'll take time to get there, and the Sovereign ships are closing in on the perimeter. If they find us, we won't let them," Mara interrupted, her voice low but commanding. "We've been preparing for this. We've trained for months, kept under the radar. The Sovereign won't know what hit them." Green nodded, but there was doubt in his eyes. They had a long journey ahead, and the Sovereign was merciless. Yet there was an undeniable resolve in Mara's gaze, something that fired up the team's sense of purpose. "What are we dealing with, Commander?" asked Dr. Sophia Kwan, the team's chief scientist, looking over the blueprints they had of the catalyst's chamber. "The reports talk about an energy source unlike anything we've encountered. If this weapon is what we think it is, it could end the war," Mara finished for her, her voice cold as steel. "And it could destroy us all in the process." The room fell silent. They all knew what the Crimson Catalyst was capable of, but the implications of unleashing it were terrifying. Yet they had no choice. Earth's people had suffered long enough. It was time to take the fight to the Sovereign and show them that humanity was far from defeated. "We leave in 2 hours, Mara said. "Prepare for everything. If the Sovereign gets to the catalyst before we do, the galaxy as we know it is finished." As her team dispersed to gather their equipment, Mara remained at the map, her gaze fixed on the galaxy. In the deepest shadows of space, the Sovereign's fleets loomed, unaware of what was about to awaken on Earth. But the Crimson Catalyst was no longer a myth, and with it, humanity's fight for survival was about to begin in earnest. The air was thick with anticipation as Mara Shaw and her team made their final preparations. The dilapidated military vessel, Vigilance, hummed with life as it powered up for the long journey to Siberia's frozen wastelands. The crew moved quickly but quietly, knowing the stakes had never been higher. Earth had been at peace for too long. The moment they made their move, they would be thrust into the fire, with every alien empire turning its eyes upon them. Mara stood in the command center, her hand resting on the cold metal console. "Status report, Lieutenant," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the low hum of activity. Green, standing at the helm, turned to her with a focused look. "We've got a 5-day window before the Sovereign's ships reach the border of Earth's atmosphere. If we don't move now, We'll be fighting for our survival before we even get close to the catalyst. Mara nodded, her mind calculating every possibility. The Sovereign was relentless, faster, stronger, and more numerous than Earth's fractured forces. Even with the Vigilance stealth capabilities, their approach to the site would be dangerous. The Sovereign scouts were everywhere, coming through every system, and their surveillance network was nearly flawless. We'll have to make our way through the outer rim, avoiding direct contact. No one can know we're coming, Mara ordered, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the map of the galactic border. Prepare for evasive maneuvers and make sure the stealth systems are fully engaged. Just as they were readying to depart, Dr. Kwan entered the room, her face pale. "Commander, we've just intercepted a transmission," she said, her voice tense. "The Sovereign's fleet is mobilizing faster than we thought. They know something is going on in the Siberian region. We don't have the luxury of time." Mara's pulse quickened. The enemy had already begun to close in, but she wouldn't back down now. She could feel the weight of humanity's future pressing on her shoulders. She turned to her team, each one of them willing to follow her to the ends of the universe. "Everyone, prepare for the worst," she said, locking eyes with each of them. "We'll make it there, and we'll take the catalyst. The fate of Earth depends on it." The Vigilance lurched into motion, shooting out of Earth's atmosphere with an eerie silence. They were heading straight into the unknown, into the heart of a war they had long been unable to fight. But now, humanity had its weapon, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. 5 days later, the Vigilance dropped out of faster-than-light travel and entered the chilling emptiness of the outer rim. The crew's nerves were taut. A Siberian facility was just ahead, hidden beneath miles of ice and stone in the desolate wilderness, a place so isolated that it had once been a forgotten relic of Earth's military past. "We're close," Green reported, his fingers dancing across the console. "No signs of Sovereign activity yet, but we'll need to stay under the radar until we reach the facility. We don't want to attract attention." But as they approached the planet, an alarm blared throughout the ship. "We've got company," Green shouted, his voice tight with urgency. "2 Sovereign scout ships, coming in fast." Mara's mind raced. They couldn't let the Sovereign get any closer. She made a split-second decision. "Activate the cloaking field. Prepare to engage evasive maneuvers on my mark." "Understood," Green replied, his hands flying over the controls. With a violent jolt, the Vigilance disappeared into the shadows of space, cloaking itself from the enemy sensors. The 2 scout ships passed just moments later, their engines glowing as they swept over the planet's surface in search of anything out of the ordinary. Mara's heart pounded in her chest. One mistake, one slip-up, and the mission would be compromised. But luck was on their side. The scout ships passed, unaware of the Vigilance presence, and the crew let out a collective breath. Mara exhaled slowly, her fingers tapping the console. "That was too close. We can't afford to make any more mistakes." With the scouts out of sight, the Vigilance finally descended into the Siberian facility's coordinates. The icy expanse of the planet stretched out before them, a vast, frozen wasteland that hid more than just ancient technology. It hid humanity's last hope. As the ship touched down, the crew suited up for the final leg of their journey. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been. They had no idea what awaited them in the depths of the facility, but they knew that whatever it was, it would change the course of the war. "We're on the ground," Mara said, her voice cold and steely. "Let's make history." And with that, they stepped out into the icy silence, ready to face whatever the Sovereign and the Catalyst had in store for them. The bitter wind howled across the Siberian landscape, whipping the team as they disembarked from the Vigilance. Their boots crunched in the snow, a harsh sound in the stillness of the frozen wasteland. The facility loomed in the distance, a massive, imposing structure partially buried in snow and ice, its exterior coated in the remnants of a long-forgotten age. The sleek metallic surfaces, now weathered by time, reflected the cold light of distant stars. Mara Shaw led the way, her breath misting in the frigid air. Every instinct she had as a commander told her to stay vigilant, to be prepared for anything. But as they neared the entrance to the facility, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Inside, the facility was a maze of steel corridors and aging technology. The walls were lined with dormant machines, some of which hummed faintly as if waiting for their time to awaken. It was eerie, this silence, but the deeper they went into the facility, the more it felt like a living thing. Something watching them, tracking their every move. "Commander, the central chamber should be just ahead," Dr. Kwan said, scanning the data on her portable console. "It's where the catalyst is stored. It's also where the highest concentration of energy signatures is coming from." "We don't have much time," Mara said, her voice sharp. "The Sovereign could be on our tail. Let's move." The team hurried forward, their boots echoing in the quiet hallways. They passed long-forgotten research labs, some of them seemingly untouched for centuries. They were getting closer, but every step felt heavier. There was an unsettling weight in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Then the silence was shattered by a loud crackle from Mara's communicator. "Commander Shaw." The voice on the other end was cold, too cold. "It's Vance." Mara's stomach tightened. Admiral Vance had been one of the few trusted figures in Earth's military, a man whose loyalty had never been questioned. Until now. His voice, usually steady and calm, now held a note of urgency, but not the kind she was used to. "Where are you?" Mara demanded, her pulse quickening. "We're almost at the catalyst." "I know. I've been tracking your progress." The pause that followed was deafening. "But I have to be honest with you, Mara. I never intended to help you." Her heart sank as the words hit her like a blow. "What are you talking about, Vance?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden surge of anger. "I've been working with the Sovereign all along," he said, his voice now laced with a chilling calmness. "You've played right into their hands. The catalyst was never meant to be used by Earth. It was a trap, a tool to lure you into the open." Mara's mind reeled. Vance, a traitor. The man she'd fought beside for years, trusted with their lives, had been a spy all along. "No," she snapped. "You're lying." "No, Mara. The catalyst is far too powerful for anyone to control, especially your fractured resistance. Earth can't handle this kind of power. I was brought in to make sure the Sovereign would get it. And now, the device is already being activated. The Sovereign's forces are on their way to your position." Mara's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. Vance had been manipulating them from the beginning. The betrayal cut deep, far deeper than she had anticipated. "Get out of there, Mara." Vance's voice was sharp, cold. "The Sovereign is coming for you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it." The communication abruptly cut off, leaving only static in its wake. "Commander, what's going on?" Green asked, his voice low and tense, but it was clear he had already heard the conversation. The shock in his eyes mirrored Mara's own disbelief. "I should have seen it sooner," Mara muttered under her breath, her mind racing. She couldn't afford to waste time on anger, though. There was no room for emotion now. The mission was still in motion, but the stakes had changed. Vance's betrayal changes everything. "We've got to move now. The Sovereign is on its way. And we got one shot at this. If we fail here, humanity's future is doomed." As she gave the order to move forward, her mind raced with the painful realization that the mission was no longer just about the catalyst. It was about survival. They had to make it out, no matter the cost. The corridor ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the walls closing in as the weight of the betrayal pressed down on them. But Mara's resolve hardened. She had always known that victory would require sacrifices, but never like this. Vance had sold them out, but they still had a chance. As long as they reached the catalyst, humanity's survival might still be possible. "Keep moving," she barked, leading her team forward, every step now laden with the knowledge that Earth's future rested in their hands, and in the hands of the Catalyst, a force that might now be their undoing. The deeper they ventured into the facility, the heavier the air seemed to grow. It was as though the place itself was alive, breathing, anticipating their arrival. The lights flickered ominously as they made their way down the cold, steel hallways, their footsteps echoing off the walls like the ticking of an inevitable clock. Mara Shaw's mind churned as she fought to maintain focus. Betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow, but she couldn't afford to let the sting of Admiral Vance's treachery cloud her judgment. There was only one thing that mattered now: reaching the Catalyst and ensuring that Earth's future remained in humanity's hands. The central chamber lay ahead. Dr. Sophia Kwan had calculated their path perfectly, and soon they found themselves at the massive, reinforced door that led into the heart of the facility. The door was covered in strange symbols, ancient and incomprehensible to the untrained eye, but the energy emanating from beyond it was undeniable. "This is it," Kwan said quietly, her fingers brushing the cold metal. "The Catalyst is inside. I can feel the power radiating from it." Mara gave a sharp nod. "We can't waste any more time. Open the door." Lieutenant Green stepped forward, his eyes scanning the door's surface for any potential traps or hidden defenses. After a tense moment, he found the activation mechanism, a small panel nestled between two of the symbols. His fingers flew over the controls, and the door groaned as it slowly began to open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The sight inside was nothing short of breathtaking. The room was enormous, its walls lined with complex machinery that hummed with power. In the center of the chamber, floating in a crystalline containment field, was the Crimson Catalyst, a gleaming, pulsating core of energy. The catalyst was a perfect sphere, its surface rippling with raw, untamed power. It glowed a deep crimson, casting eerie shadows across the room. Mara's breath caught in her throat as she took in the sight. This was it, the weapon that could change the fate of the galaxy. But as her eyes traced the edges of the chamber, a sense of dread washed over her. The Sovereign's forces were close, too close. They would be here any moment, and they couldn't afford to waste another second. "Dr. Kwan, can you access it?" Mara asked, her voice tight with urgency. Kwan nodded, her fingers already flying over the console beside the catalyst. "It's heavily encrypted, but I can bypass most of the security protocols. Give me a few minutes." The tension in the air grew palpable as they waited, every second feeling like an eternity. Mara's eyes scanned the chamber, her hand hovering over her sidearm. She knew the Sovereign could come at any moment, and they would need every advantage to survive the inevitable fight. Then the alarms began to blare, a shrill warning echoing through the facility. Mara's heart sank. The Sovereign had found them. "We don't have time," Mara shouted. "Dr. Kwan, hurry." "I'm doing my best," Kwan replied, her voice trained. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked furiously to unlock the catalyst. The room shook slightly as the energy within the containment field fluctuated. With every passing moment, the hum of the catalyst grew louder, vibrating through the entire facility like a living thing. Suddenly, the doors at the far end of the chamber burst open with a deafening roar, and Sovereign soldiers poured in, their weapons aimed directly at the team. The blinding light of their plasma rifles illuminated the room, and the Sovereign had them cornered. Mara's heart raced, but she didn't falter. "Fall back," she ordered. "Take positions." She drew her weapon and fired, the shots ringing out as they hit their targets. The soldiers, trained and efficient, returned fire, but Mara and her team were ready. Green moved with deadly precision, his shots precise, taking out one enemy soldier after another. But they were outnumbered, and it was only a matter of time before the Sovereign overwhelmed them. "Dr. Kwan, we need to activate the catalyst," Mara shouted, her voice rising above the chaos. "I'm almost there," Kwan replied through gritted teeth. Mara's eyes darted back and forth. trying to keep her team safe while buying Quan the time she needed. Green was covering their back, picking off Sovereign soldiers as they advanced. But for every soldier they took down, 2 more appeared in the doorway. The room was becoming a battlefield. In a desperate move, Mara made a decision. Green, cover me. I'm going for the catalyst. Green looked at her, eyes wide with disbelief. Are you crazy? It's too dangerous. We don't have a choice. Mara snapped, determination setting in. She sprinted toward the catalyst, dodging fire as she went. The walls around her seemed to close in, and the ground trembled beneath her feet as the energy from the catalyst surged. She reached the containment field and slammed her hand against the console. A pulse of energy shot through her, and the containment field flickered. It was now or never. With a sharp, final movement, Mara pressed the activation button. The catalyst's energy flared to life, flooding the chamber with blinding crimson light. The room exploded with power as the energy surged outward, destabilizing the Sovereign soldiers' weapons and forcing them back. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Mara felt hope surge through her veins. But the battle was far from over. The catalyst had awakened, but its true power had yet to be realized. And the Sovereign would stop at nothing to claim it. The blinding crimson light from the catalyst flooded the room, pushing back the Sovereign soldiers who had advanced on the team. For a moment, everything seemed frozen in time, the air humming with raw energy, the shockwave from the catalyst's power cascading through the chamber, scattering the invaders. It was as if the universe itself had momentarily buckled under the sheer force emanating from the core. Mara Shaw's heart pounded in her chest. The moment she had fought for had arrived. The catalyst had been activated, but the price of such power was steep. The air crackled with energy, and the walls of the chamber groaned, as if the very structure of the facility was being torn apart by the forces it was not built to contain. We've awakened something far bigger than we anticipated, Dr. Quan murmured, her fingers still working furiously on the console. Her face was flushed, her brow slick with sweat as the vibrations from the catalyst intensified. Mara's mind raced. The catalyst's energy was pushing back the Sovereign forces, but for how long? Every second they had now was precious. They couldn't afford to wait too long. The Sovereign's fleet was inbound, and they would be here soon. The team had to move, or they'd be caught in the fury of an unstoppable force. Everyone, fall back to the vigilance, Mara shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Green, Quan, cover our retreat. Green nodded, his jaw set in determination as he moved to the front of the group, his weapon raised. Quan hesitated, her fingers still twitching on the control panel as she tried to manipulate the catalyst's interface. She seemed unwilling to leave the power they had just unlocked. I need more time, Commander, Quan said breathlessly, her voice almost pleading. If I can stabilize the catalyst's core, it could amplify its power even further. We could wipe out the Sovereign's fleet before they even reach us. Mara's instincts screamed at her to move, to not let the Sovereign take them by surprise. But the temptation of such overwhelming power was difficult to ignore. The catalyst could tip the scales in their favor, but would it be enough? Could they truly control it? No time, Mara said firmly, turning toward the door. We're not taking any more chances. We'll come back for it. We have to get to the ship before they lock us in here. A blast of energy ricocheted off the walls nearby, sending a shower of sparks flying. It was clear that the Sovereign weren't waiting for them to make the first move. They were already regrouping, preparing for another assault. Dr. Quan hesitated but then nodded, her fingers finally releasing the console as she stepped away from the catalyst. You're right. Let's go. The team moved quickly, keeping low and staying out of sight as much as possible. The tension in the air was unbearable. Every step forward was another step closer to their freedom, but also closer to the Sovereign's guns. The corridor ahead of them had become a deadly gauntlet. As they neared the exit, the sounds of Sovereign soldiers regrouping reached them. Mara knew they wouldn't make it to the vigilance without a fight. Her mind raced for a plan, but there was no time. She turned to Green, who was already looking to her for orders. "Green, I need you to hold them off," Mara said, her voice sharp. "Quan, you're with me. We're getting to the ship, no matter what." Green gave a tight nod. "Understood. I'll cover your six." Mara and Quan darted toward the exit, weapons raised. As they moved, explosions rang out around them, and the sound of plasma fire filled the air. They could hear the sovereign forces closing in, but there was no turning back now. The doors to the hangar bay of the Vigilance were within sight, the cold exterior of the ship gleaming under the harsh lights. The ship was their only way out, but the sovereign soldiers were fast closing the distance. "Go," Mara shouted, breaking into a sprint. Quan kept pace beside her, both of them dodging fire as they neared the ship. The blast doors to the hangar bay were opening slowly, the massive metal gates grinding on their hinges. Mara's eyes flicked to the control panel as she approached. There was a possibility, just a slim chance, that they might make it before the Sovereign completely cornered them. "Green," Mara yelled. "Move." Green's voice crackled over the comms. "I'm holding them back as long as I can, but you've got seconds." Mara's heart raced. The hangar was just a few meters away now. Her pulse thundered in her ears, and the world around her seemed to slow. She could see Green, his back to them, holding the line against a growing tide of sovereign soldiers. His gun roared with a constant barrage of fire, but he couldn't hold them off forever. Finally, the doors opened wide enough for Mara and Quan to slip through. They dove into the Vigilance, and Mara slammed her hand against the ship's control panel. The doors began to close behind them, just as the first wave of sovereign soldiers rounded the corner. Inside the ship, Green was already securing the cockpit. "We're good to go," he said, "but we're not out of the woods yet." The Vigilance roared to life as the ship's engines fired up, and the blast doors sealed shut behind them. They were airborne, but the Sovereign fleet was still coming. The battle was far from over. Mara's eyes locked onto the catalyst's energy readings on the ship's main display. It was pulsing with raw, untapped power. And in that moment, she knew that the war for humanity's survival had just begun. "Prepare for battle," Mara said, her voice steady but fierce. "We're about to show the galaxy what Earth can do." The Vigilance surged through the atmosphere, the starboard thrusters flaring with intensity as they accelerated into the inky blackness of space. Outside, the glowing mass of the Sovereign's fleet loomed like a dark storm, encircling Earth's last hope like vultures to a carcass. Mara Shaw stood at the helm, her fingers gripping the console as the ship shuddered under the sudden thrust. The ship's hull groaned in protest, but the Vigilance held firm. It was a relic, built for combat in the early days of Earth's space exploration, but it was the only ship they had now, and it had to be enough. "We're clear of the atmosphere," Green reported, his voice steady but tense. "Sovereign fleet is closing fast. They've got us on their radar." "Bring up the shields to full," Mara commanded, her eyes scanning the redouts. The ship's defense systems whined as they powered up, but the Sovereign fleet was a formidable opponent. They outnumbered them, and they had more advanced technology. But they didn't have the catalyst, and that, Mara hoped, would be the great equalizer. Dr. Sophia Kwan was at the operations station, her fingers flying over the control panel. The glow from the catalyst flickered in the corner of the ship's sensors display, a pulsing beacon of potential. It was still unstable, but it was their last shot at survival. The catalyst's power was unlike anything they had ever seen, raw, untamed, and capable of leveling an entire fleet if harnessed properly. "The catalyst is charged," Kwan said, her voice tense. "It's ready to deploy, but I can't guarantee the results. We're talking about an untested weapon of unimaginable power. We have to be careful. One misfire could destroy everything." Mara didn't flinch. "We don't have time to be careful. We either use it or we die." Kwan hesitated, but then nodded, her face set in grim determination. "Understood." The ship shuddered again as the Sovereign's lead destroyer locked its targeting systems onto the Vigilance. Mara watched the readouts, and her heart skipped a beat as a red warning flashed across the screen. "Brace for impact," Mara barked. The Sovereign's first wave of plasma fire slammed into the Vigilance shields with a violent jolt. The energy flared across the ship's hull, sending a wave of vibrations that rattled their bones. The shields held, barely, but Mara could see the power reserves draining with alarming speed. "Shields at 50%, Green shouted, his voice trained. Mara clenched her jaw. "We can't take another hit like that. Quan, activate the catalyst." Quan nodded and quickly typed in the sequence to target the Sovereign fleet. The air in the cockpit felt charged, and a low hum filled the room as the catalyst's energy began to surge into the ship's weapon systems. The ship groaned under the pressure, and Mara could almost feel the catalyst's power crackling in the air like a living thing. "Here we go," Quan muttered, her voice tight with anticipation. The ship's weapon systems powered up, the array of energy cannons on the Vigilance, underbelly glowing ominously. Mara's hands hovered over the controls as the targeting reticule locked onto the largest Sovereign ship. The destroyer was the flagship, and its destruction would send a clear message to the invaders. A pulse of crimson light flared from the catalyst's core, feeding directly into the ship's weapon systems. The Vigilance cannons charged with unimaginable force, and Mara felt the power surge through her fingertips as she fired. The beam that erupted from the ship was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. It was a searing, concentrated pulse of crimson energy that lanced through the blackness of space with a blinding intensity. It struck the Sovereign flagship with a deafening crack, and for a split second, time seemed to freeze. Then, the explosion came. The destroyer's hull ruptured in a violent display of destruction as the catalyst's energy tore through its shields and pierced deep into its core. The flagship disintegrated in a flash, turning into a cloud of debris that was scattered across the void of space. The shockwave from the explosion rippled through the surrounding fleet, knocking out nearby ships and sending them careening into each other. Mara's breath caught in her throat. The catalyst had worked, but the price had been high. The Vigilance systems flickered, the power reserves draining rapidly as the weapon's backlash threatened to overload their circuits. "Power levels are critical," Quan shouted. "We need to shut it down before we're caught in the blast radius." Mara acted quickly, slamming her hand onto the emergency override to cut off the catalyst connection to the ship. The energy output ceased, and the hum that had filled the cockpit died down. The ship's systems stabilized, but the damage had been done. The Sovereign fleet was thrown into chaos, but Mara knew it wouldn't last long. "We're not out of the woods yet," Green said, his voice tight with urgency. "More ships are coming in from the rear." Mara's eyes flicked to the scanners. The Sovereign fleet was regrouping. The destruction of their flagship had caused confusion, but it wouldn't stop them from fighting back. They needed to act fast before the full force of the enemy brought them down. "Set a course for the nearest space station," Mara ordered. "We'll regroup, patch up the ship, and hit them again. We've only just begun." The Vigilance lurched as the engines roared back to life, and they shot into the blackness of space, leaving the burning remains of the Sovereign flagship behind. The battle had only just begun, but Mara Shaw was certain of one thing. Humanity's fury had been unleashed, and it wouldn't be stopped. The Vigilance sped through the void, leaving a trail of fiery destruction in its wake. The remnants of the Sovereign flagship floated behind them like a grim reminder of the power they had just unleashed. But Mara knew that the destruction of one ship, however significant, would not deter the Sovereign. They were far from finished. The galaxy's most formidable invaders were still in pursuit, and they had only begun to understand the true potential of Earth's fury. "Status report, Quan," Mara said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. Quan's fingers flew over the controls as she scanned the damage reports. "We've sustained significant hull damage," she replied. "Shields are at 30%, and the power core is unstable after that catalyst blast. I can't promise we'll be able to fire again like that anytime soon. Mara nodded. It was a sobering reality. They had used the catalyst's power to devastating effect, but it had nearly crippled the vigilance. They were alive, but they were vulnerable. And the Sovereign knew it. The next strike could be their last. We need to find cover, Mara said. Get us to that station on the edge of the system. We can make repairs there. Green, who had been monitoring the rear scanners, grimaced. There's more than just one station on the edge of the system, Commander. The Sovereign are coming in from all directions now. They're closing in fast. We won't make it to the station without a fight. Mara's mind raced. The Sovereign's fleet had regrouped quickly, and they were moving in with precision. Earth's last ship was powerful, but outnumbered and outgunned. She needed to think of something that would give them an edge. Something unexpected. Get us to the station anyway, Mara ordered. We can't outrun them, but we can fight them on our terms. We'll use the station's defenses to our advantage. Quan nodded, her face grim as she inputted the new coordinates. The vigilance banked hard, heading toward the edge of the system. The space station was a relic of the early days of humanity's expansion into the stars, an abandoned research facility long since forgotten by most. But it was still operational, and its weaponry could help even the odds. As they approached the station, the void around them filled with the ominous hum of Sovereign warships closing in. The vigilance was in their sights, but Mara refused to give in. They weren't going down without a fight. Not now. Not when they had something the Sovereign didn't, human resolve. We'll have to make our way inside quickly, Mara said, her eyes scanning the station's exterior as it loomed ahead. Green, Quan, ready yourselves. We'll use the station's defenses as cover, but we need to move fast before they surround us. Green checked his weapon, his face hard with determination. Understood. I'll cover the rear while you and Quan move to the main control center. We need to get the station's weapon systems online. The vigilance shuddered as another wave of plasma fire from the Sovereign fleet rocketed past them, narrowly missing the ship's damaged hull. Mara's pulse quickened, but she steeled herself. They could make it. She would make sure of it. Move out, Mara barked, and the team sprang into action. The vigilance docked with the station's external bay, the massive docking clamps locking into place with a metallic groan. The door to the station's airlock hissed open, and the team quickly disembarked, weapons drawn and ready for a fight. The air inside the station was cold and sterile, the dim lights flickering above them as they moved down the long, empty corridors. There was no sign of life, only the hum of ancient machinery and the distant rumble of the Sovereign fleet moving closer. Mara's voice crackled over the comms. Green, keep the perimeter secure. Quan, get to the control room. I'll meet you there. On it, Green replied. Quan moved swiftly, her fingers already working to bring the station's systems online. Mara followed closely behind, her senses alert. The walls of the station seemed to close in around them, the oppressive silence broken only by the sounds of their footsteps and the occasional distant explosion from outside. Almost there, Quan muttered, her voice tight with focus. I've got access to the weapons systems. If we can power up the main reactors, we can launch a series of defense drones to help with the incoming attack. It's not much, but it's something. That's all we need, Mara replied, her eyes flicking to the monitors as they came online. A map of the station's external defenses illuminated the screen, showing multiple points of vulnerability where the Sovereign could strike. The station's exterior cameras blinked to life, and Mara saw the Sovereign ships approaching in formation, their massive hulls dark against the backdrop of the stars. They had arrived. We're running out of time, Quan said urgently, her fingers flying across the terminal. We need to power up the station's energy cores now to activate the defense systems. Mara nodded, her expression hardening. Do it. This station is our last chance. The screens flickered as the power cores began to hum to life, but the station was still a massive target in the midst of the Sovereign fleet. Mara knew they had only one shot to survive this, and she had no intention of failing now. "Prepare for the reckoning," Mara whispered under her breath. "Let's show them what humanity can really do." The hum of the station's energy cores grew louder, a low thrumming vibration that reverberated through the steel floors of the control room. Outside, the Sovereign fleet was closing in, their ships forming a perfect arc, poised to strike the Vigilance and the abandoned station with overwhelming force. Their attack was imminent, and there was no escape now. "Defense drones online," Quan said, her voice a mixture of relief and urgency. "We've got a limited number, maybe a dozen at most, but they'll be enough to disrupt their assault." "Good," Mara replied, her eyes locked on the tactical map of the station's defenses. "Green, get to the external airlock and prep for the incoming battle. I want those drones up and running as soon as possible. Quan, keep working on boosting the power." Green, his face hard as stone, gave a quick nod. "Got it. I'll make sure nothing gets through." The airlock hissed as it opened behind them, and Mara could see Green's silhouette as he moved out into the cold expanse of the station. She turned back to the control panel, watching as Quan worked tirelessly to feed more power into the station's systems. Time was running out. The Sovereign were almost upon them. The screens flickered as the energy levels climbed higher, and the main reactor came online with a deafening roar. The distant hum of the station's energy systems intensified, matching the pounding of Mara's heart as they neared the final stage of their desperate plan. "They're in range," Quan said, her voice strained. "I've activated the drones. They're launching now." The station's external sensors blinked to life, showing a dozen sleek, angular drones ejecting from their launch bays, their ion engines flaring to life as they sped into the vastness of space. They were a makeshift solution, but they were armed with a variety of advanced weaponry capable of intercepting and disabling the incoming Sovereign ships. A small measure of hope surged in Mara's chest. "Green, how's it looking out there?" she asked. "I've got eyes on the enemy," Green replied over the comms. "The Sovereign are moving fast, but they're not prepared for the drones. They're already taking out the first wave." Mara allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, but she knew better than to get complacent. The Sovereign weren't the type to back down from a setback. They would adapt, and fast. A deep rumble shook the station as the Sovereign fleet opened fire, sending a barrage of plasma beams and energy blasts toward the station. The drones intercepted most of them, their shields flaring bright as they absorbed the incoming fire. But the Sovereign ships were relentless, their overwhelming numbers pressing in on all sides. "Keep them off us, Quan," Mara shouted. "We need those drones to hold." "I'm doing everything I can," Quan responded, her hands flying across the console, pushing the station's energy output to the limit. "The drones are holding, but they can't last forever." The Vigilance was still docked with the station, its weapons offline but its crew bracing for the inevitable. Mara knew they had only one option left, an all-or-nothing strike that would either win the war or doom them all. "Get me a direct line to the Vigilance," she said urgently. "Comms are open," Quan responded. Mara tapped into the comm channel, her voice steady but laced with determination. "Commander Shaw to Vigilance. Prepare to fire all remaining weapons on the Sovereign flagship. We're going to end this now." There was a brief pause before Shaw's voice came through. "Understood, Commander. We're ready to fire on your mark." The Sovereign's fire intensified, and the drones were quickly overwhelmed. The space around the station erupted in a violent display of energy as the Sovereign pressed their assault, determined to finish the fight. But Mara had no intention of being a passive player in this war. "We're launching now," Mara said, her eyes narrowing with focus. "Do it, Shaw." With the final command given, the Vigilance remaining weapons flared to life, their power harnessed by the station's external systems. The colossal burst of energy shot into space like a focused beam of wrath, piercing through the Sovereign ships with the precision of a sniper. The beam struck the flagship with brutal force, its shields failing under the intensity of the blast. Explosions rippled through the Sovereign flagship's hull, sending debris scattering across the vacuum of space. The shockwave from the blast reverberated throughout the battlefield, and for a moment, Mara allowed herself to believe that they might have done it. But then, as the dust settled, she saw it. The Sovereign fleet was regrouping, their flagship still functional, though heavily damaged. "They're not finished yet," Quan said grimly. "We've hit them hard, but they'll keep coming. We need more firepower." Mara's eyes narrowed. She had one last trick left, and it was a risk, but there was no other option. The station's main reactor was still unstable from the catalyst's overload, but if they could overload it completely, they could trigger a chain reaction powerful enough to wipe out the Sovereign fleet in one final cataclysmic explosion. She turned to Quan, her voice calm despite the chaos unfolding around them. "Prepare to overload the reactor." Quan's eyes widened with shock. "Are you sure? If we do that, we'll be caught in the blast too." Mara nodded, her face resolute. "We do this for Earth. We end this now." With one final command, they initiated the reactor overload. The station shuddered violently as the energy levels reached critical mass. The Sovereign fleet, realizing what was happening, attempted to retreat, but it was too late. The station's energy core exploded in a brilliant flash of light. The shockwave tore through the Sovereign fleet, their ships disintegrating in a violent display of destruction. The last remnants of humanity's fury had been unleashed, and the galaxy would never forget the day Earth fought back.